lesser known Jewish holidays is perhaps the more generous way to frame it, because there are Jews who observe these holidays. They're not made up, they're not forgotten, but they're ones that we may be much less familiar with in the liberal Jewish world. Now, what's the stereotype of the Jewish holiday? The joke version is, they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. And that's supposed to be the story of every Jewish holiday. Now, as humanistic Jews, when someone makes a claim about the truth of something, we are willing to ask, what's your evidence? How do you know that? What reason do you have to believe this is true? So let's take a look at how true that claim is, that all the Jewish holidays are, they tried to kill us, they failed, and let's eat. In fact, we have a chart of all the holidays, or at least many of the holidays, as you'll see, looking at, did they try to kill us? Are we still alive? And do we get to eat? Okay. Now you see right off the bat, the first two big ones don't qualify for the stereotype. Rosh Hashanah, nobody's trying to kill us. Yes, we're alive, and no, you don't get to eat on Yom Kippur, at least traditionally. Sukkot, again, no attempt to kill. Hanukkah is the first time. Yes, they tried to kill us. Yes, we're still alive. Yes, let's eat. Tu B'Shvat, no, doesn't apply there. Purim, there's another one. Yes, yes, yes. Passover, yes, yes, yes. But Shavuot, Tisha B'Av, yes, they tried to kill us, but it's a fast day, so no, you don't get to eat. So you can see, even with this list of holidays, there's really only 3 holidays that qualify for they tried to kill us, we're still alive, and let's eat. They're Hanukkah, Purim, and Passover. Now, guess which of those 3 are the 2 most observed Jewish holidays, particularly among the non-Orthodox? It is Passover and Hanukkah. It's supported by the surrounding culture's celebration of Christmas and Easter. It's turn of the season time. It's a family event. It's in the home. There's food attached to it. There's all kinds of reasons why Hanukkah and Passover are the most observed Jewish holidays. And that's why people think that Jewish holidays are, they tried to kill us, we're still alive, let's eat. Because what they experience are Hanukkah, Passover, and maybe they remember Purim from a Purim carnival. Well, another urban legend bites the dust, I guess. And this chart doesn't even include all of the prescribed Jewish holidays. Well, you might think this is all the ones you've ever heard of, but in fact, there are more. So now we're going to look at a more complete list, and we're going to examine a number of the holidays that have been added on the second version of the list. By the way, I'll also point out, if you look at the code, you have biblical holidays that are prescribed in the Hebrew Bible. And then the blue ones are rabbinic holidays that aren't described in the Hebrew Bible directly, or certainly from the Torah, whereas they were prescribed by the rabbis. Purim is an interesting one because it doesn't show up in a list of holidays, but it's based on a biblical book, the book of Esther. But Tu B'Shvat isn't there, Hanukkah isn't there, and so on. So here's our next chart. This is a more complete list. Even this list isn't complete with all of the fast days that are on the calendar, as we'll see. But the more you expand the list, the less you get to fit that stereotype of they tried to kill us, we're still alive, let's eat. Because a number of the days that are added are minor fast days. You can see the code at the bottom there. So all those minor fast days, there's no eating, so they don't qualify. And when it's a minor fast, by the way, it means you fast from the morning through the evening. Whereas the major fasts, like Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, or the fast of Yom Kippur, you fast a full 24, even 26 hours from the night before through the next evening. The minor fasts are a little bit shorter. But you can see a number of holidays now are on this list that don't qualify. And again, many of the names of these holidays you may have never seen before because, you know, unless you installed the Jewish Google Calendar on your calendar or iCal, you may have never seen them show up before. In fact, we do worse on the all 3 metric. Notice only 50, you have a stats at the bottom, and everyone loves statistics. 50% of the holidays are they tried to kill us. 75% of the holidays were still alive, except for the disaster ones. And 2/3 of the holidays, yes, we get to eat, but another third, you don't get to eat. So what are these obscure, lesser known holidays? Well, the reason I came up with this topic was this week was the observance of the fast of Tammuz, or you see it near the bottom, Tzom Tammuz. Tzom means fast in Hebrew. The fast of Tammuz took place this past week. What was that about? Well, we'll find out. And we'll find out where the rest of these holidays came from and why they're lesser known today. Now, one of the sources for the prescription of these holidays comes from the book of Zechariah, one of the latest books written that made it into the Hebrew Bible. And it describes a series of fast days that have occurred in Jewish history or in biblical history. It refers to the fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th month, the fast of the 7th month, and the fast of the 10th month. But those will all become times for joy and gladness when they return from exile to the land of Israel, as long as they love honesty and integrity and follow the rules. So this is prescribing a series of fast days in certain months. We don't know the exact date, and it doesn't give us any reason of what they're talking about. But evidently, by the time this was written, there was a tradition of fast days in these particular months, some of which might not have been prescribed. Now, one thing we have to remember with the counting of the months, the Bible very rarely gives names for months. It simply refers to in the 1st month, the 4th month, the 7th month, etc. But when you read the biblical calendar described, for example, in Leviticus chapter 23, the 1st month is when Passover takes place. That's also sometimes called the Aviv, the spring. And the 7th month in that calendar is the time of the Day of Atonements and the blowing of the shofar. But you can understand why they didn't call that observance, the blowing of the shofar, Rosh Hashanah yet, because that means the head of the year, the new year, and it was the 7th month in the biblical calendar. So Rosh Hashanah actually never appears in the biblical calendar because the first day of the 7th month is a day of shofar blowing, but it's not the head of the year. In the rabbinic calendar, conversely, the 1st month is in the fall, and it's called the month of Tishrei. And the 7th month occurs in the spring, and it is the month in which Passover occurs. So you can see already that there's been a shifting of the calendar by 6 months from spring to fall for the new year, and that may shift what's meant by these 1st months, 4th months, 10th months, and so on. And you'll also notice by the time the rabbis do a calendar, they have names for the months. Now, what's fascinating about the names for the months is that Jews didn't invent them. They're based on the Babylonian calendar. The Babylonian calendar started in the fall with a month called Tishritum, and its spring festival took place in Nisanu, and the month before Nisanu was called Adar, and Kislimu was the winter month, like Kislev, when Hanukkah takes place. I mean, it's really fascinating to see that we borrowed it from somebody else, and now the Babylonians are gone, and we're still using their calendar. So this fast that took place this week is the fast of the 17th of Tammuz. Now, this text I have here comes from a collection of Jewish law called the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, or the abbreviated short version of the Set Table, which was a code of Jewish law written some centuries before. This is like a Reader's Digest version. And here it gives, based on Jewish tradition, 5 tragic events that occurred on the day of the 17th of Tammuz. Now, one thing I'll point out is that if there was actually a clear event that took place on that day unambiguously, they would have only given one reason. But the fact that they're not really sure means they come up with multiple reasons to try to explain it. So first, the tablets of the covenant, the 10 commandments, were broken by Moses when he came down from Mount Sinai, and this occurred on the 17th day of Tammuz. That's the claim anyway. So this is not the Mel Brooks version where he dropped one and it went from 15 to 10 commandments. This is the version in the Bible where the Jews made a golden calf to worship the gods, and Moses was so mad at the golden calf that he smashed the first set of the 10 commandments. A second reason that's given is that the daily sacrifices were abolished, being given in the temple in Jerusalem. A third reason given is that on this exact same day, the very day the tablets of the 10 commandments were broken by Moses, the Romans broke through the wall of Jerusalem during the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, although the destruction of the First Temple, the wall was breached on the 9th of Tammuz, as it is written, in the 4th month, on the 9th of the month, a famine was growing. This is in the book of Jeremiah. But the destruction of the second temple, it was made a different day. And the second temple affects us more deeply, says the rabbi. And it also mentions the Jerusalem Talmud claims it was also made on the 17th, but they made a mistake. Amazing, they admit that they made a mistake. Another reason given for the 17th of Tammuz fast is that the wicked apostemos burned a Torah scroll. This is a Greek trying to persecute the Jews. And then finally, the 5th reason given, an idol was placed in the temple by some wicked people among the Jews, and this caused the destruction of the temple and our exile. Notice, by the way, that 5th reason is a lot like the 1st reason, because Moses breaks the tablets from the sin of the golden calf and building an idol by Jews. So these are all the reasons given by the rabbis for why Jews fast on the 17th of Tammuz. But it turns out none of them are the real reason why Jews have a mourning day in the month of Tammuz. As I mentioned, the month names come from Babylonian practice. And in this case, the month name is not only Babylonian, it's named after a Babylonian god. So on the left, you'll see a clay tablet from the Amorite period, which is 2000 to 1600 BCE. It's a text that laments the death of Dumuzi. Dumuzi, or Tammuz, was a Babylonian god. He was the consort of Inanna, who later becomes Ishtar. And she was sent down to the underworld at one point, and he volunteers to replace her, or some say she makes a swap and he winds up replacing her, and he has to live in the underworld for a period of time every year. This may sound familiar from the Persephone myths in Greek mythology. Now, what's fascinating is the death of Dumuzi, the death of a god who gets reborn. Where have I heard that story before? Again, as Ecclesiastes said, there's nothing new under the sun. But what makes this an interesting detail is there are a lot of texts from Mesopotamian culture and practice that describe women baking cakes for Dumuzi and wailing for Dumuzi during the month of Tammuz. And there's even a passage in the Hebrew Bible that refers to it. When Ezekiel is living in the Babylonian exile and he's complaining about all the bad things the Hebrews are doing and in breaking their covenant with the Hebrew God Yahweh, so he is brought to see the gate of Yahweh's house and sees women crying for Tammuz. And then he said to me, have you seen this? Turn again, you'll see even greater abominations than these. So obviously, Jewish women, following the practice of the women bewailing the god Dumuzi, had picked up this practice of a mourning ritual in this month in the summer, this month of Tammuz Dumuzi. And later on, rabbis had to come up with reasons for why people keep mourning in this month. But the origin of the observance may well have been a Babylonian practice, remembering the death of a god. So that's the first of these holidays, the 17th of Tammuz that just took place this week. Now, the Jewish calendar begins in the month of Tishrei, which is in the fall, remember, and you have on the first day of the month of Tishrei, the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, because now it's the new year. And the second day, you have another holiday. It's the second day of Rosh Hashanah for those who observe 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. But the third day is this fast of Gdalia. It's actually a fast day after 2 days of Rosh Hashanah time. Now, why did this fast take place? According to this source again, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, when Gdalia, the son of Achikam, was killed, after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar left him in Eretz Yisrael, appointed him governor over Israel, and because Gdalia was assassinated, all the Jews were exiled and thousands of them were killed, and thus the last ember of Jewish hope died. So you would think that, maybe this Gdalia was a hero or someone very important for the Jews. In fact, if you read the passage that appears in the book of 2 Kings, you might be surprised to hear about it. This is actually 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 22 to 26. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon put Gdalia in charge of the people whom he left behind. He had conquered Jerusalem, he had killed all the king's sons, and he took the king and the elites of Jerusalem with him to Babylon, and he left the peasants on the ground, because peasants are peasants. He wasn't worried about them. And Gdalia was put in charge, some of the officers of the troops and their men came to see him, and Gdalia reassured them and said, "Do not be afraid of the servants of the Chaldeans. Stay in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you." So who is Gdalia? He's a puppet. He's a puppet governor of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who just destroyed Jerusalem. And in the 7th month, Ishmael, who was of royal descent, so from the line of the king, came with 10 men, and they struck down Gdalia, and he died. And they killed the Judeans and Chaldeans present with him at Mitzpah. And all the people who did this, and the officers of the troops, set out and went to Egypt. They fled because they were afraid of the Chaldeans. Now notice, the rabbinic version from the 19th century says, because he was assassinated, all the Jews were exiled and thousands were killed, as if it was done to them. But the version in the Bible says that, in fact, they fled in advance to make sure that the Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldeans didn't come back to punish them for killing his puppet governor. So I find it fascinating that one of the fast days is to mourn the assassination of the puppet governor of the conqueror. I would think that would be a party, not a fast day. Now, another holiday that takes place shortly thereafter, we have the end of the Jewish New Year with Yom Kippur. We have Sukkot, the harvest holiday with the Sukkah, and Sukkot lasts for 7 days. But there's another holiday that occurs at the end of Sukkot. Here's a description of Sukkot in the book of Leviticus. On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you've gathered in the yield of your land, you observe the festival of Yahweh to last 7 days, a complete rest on the first day, and a complete rest on the 8th day. So you have 7 full days and then a day of rest, because you got to take down the sukkah. There's some work to do, but you rest on the 8th day. And the word for 8 in Hebrew is shemone. So shemini means the 8th, and atzeret means the closing or the stopping. In fact, in modern Hebrew, on a stop sign, you'll see the word atzor. Atzor means stop, like a stop sign. So the shemini atzeret means the 8th stopping day, or the 8th closing day for Sukkot. It marks the end of the festival, because you live in the Sukkot and the booths for 7 days, but the 8th day is also an observance. And in fact, remember I mentioned the 2nd day of Rosh Hashanah? This was an institution of adding a 2nd day, like a 2nd Seder day as well, just in case you didn't know the calendar exactly. Well, the rabbis decided we needed to add a 2nd day to Shmini Atzeret also. And so the 2nd day for Shmini Atzeret, which is like the 9th day of Sukkot almost, is now a holiday called Simchat Torah. So the reason why Simchat Torah lands so close to Sukkot after you've just had Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is because you had the 8th day of Shemini Atzeret at the end of Sukkot, and then the extra 8th day, or the 9th day, which becomes Simchat Torah. Now there's also another fast day. This one, by the way, didn't even make that chart I gave you. The 10th day of Tevet, prescribed as a fast day according to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, because the king Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to it and crushed it, and this led to the destruction of the temple. And this is actually a citation from 2 Kings. In the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month. Okay, so the 10th day of the 10th month, if you're counting from Nisan as the first month, and that's remember the spring month as the beginning of the year, then the 10th month will be the month of Tevet, which happens just before the month of that Purim appears in. And so this is described in 2 Kings as part of the siege of Jerusalem, and so a fast day is decreed at that time by the rabbis. That actually has some basis to it. Now, there's 2 other fast days that appeared in that chart early on. It referred to the fast of Esther and the fast of the Bechorot, the fast of the firstborn sons that happens just before Passover. These are 2 rabbinic holidays added in some ways to make the festival even more joyful. Remember in the story of Esther and Purim, she fasts for 3 days before she goes to the king and turns in Haman, which saves the Jews. And so there's an idea of a reenactment of that kind of fasting before the celebration in a fast the day before Purim. And the fast of the firstborn takes place the night before Passover, because that's supposedly when the firstborn were killed by the angel of death going through, and he saw the blood on the houses, so avoided the Jewish homes, but killed the firstborn of all the Egyptians. Those are also minor fast days that make their way into the Jewish calendar. There's 2 more that we're going to talk about today, though. One is called Lag BaOmer. Now, the log actually is just from the Hebrew numbering system. I put the letters there as well, because Hebrew does not have a separate character system for numbers. You know, in English, we have the Roman alphabet or Latin letters, and then we have, quote, Arabic numerals, because they were derived by Arabic mathematicians as a distinct from the Arabic alphabet. So in Hebrew, they didn't pick that up. They only used the Hebrew letters for numbers. And the way you would say 33 is Lamed Gimel, or Log. We'll see another example of that in just a little bit. And what happens is, after Passover, you start counting what's called the Omer, which are the wheat sheaves. And it says in the Bible, you're supposed to count for 50 days of the Omer until you get to the holiday of Shavuot, which means weeks. It's actually 7 cycles of seven countings of the 7 days of a week. So if you count 7 weeks, you get to 49 days, and the 50th day is the holiday of Shavuot. So the problem is that during those 50 days, there are some limitations to what you're allowed to do. It's seen as sort of an inauspicious time. And so, as you see in this description, they're coming up with a reason for why this takes place. During the first 33 days of the Sefirah, the counting period of the Omer, the disciples of Rabbi Akiva perished. They were being killed. This is imagined to be during the middle of the 2nd century BCE, when there was a revolt against the Romans, and it was decreed to be illegal to teach Torah or Jewish law. And so Rabbi Akiva and his students would hide out and sneak and run around, and many of them were caught and killed. And the thought is it's happening during this period. So even if originally it might have been just a bad sign or bad omen days or taboo, now they come up with a new reason to not do special things during that period of counting up to day 33. Therefore, it's custom during these days to observe a partial state of mourning. Marriages should not be performed, and you should not take a haircut or a shave. On Lag BaOmer, and from that day on, what was restricted is now permitted, because on Lag BaOmer his disciples ceased to die. And therefore we rejoice somewhat, although on that day some of them died, so you don't observe mourning for a full day, and there's all kinds of legalistic things around here. But the point is that in those 33 days of counting up to Lag BaOmer, you're supposed to have a partial state of mourning, no marriages and no haircuts and no outwardly joyful events. Now, what's interesting about it is when you're not allowed to do something for a period of time, all of a sudden getting to do it becomes important. For example, how many of us went a long period of time without a haircut? And then we were allowed to do it. And it felt great. And it's wonderful. So what happens actually is Lag BaOmer becomes a kind of a miniature festival day. And in some communities, it became the first day that children get their first haircut. There's a whole tradition of little kids at age 3 going for their first haircut on Lag BaOmer. It also became traditional to light bonfires. And in some cases, people would pretend to be the disciples of Rabbi Akiva who were pretending to go hunting. And they take bows and arrows and wander around talking Torah. So some people will have archery contests as a way to observe Lag BaOmer. Again, it's a holiday in search of a reason, you know, or maybe in search of an observance because it's marked as a day, but not highlighted as anything that we have to note in a clear way. But for us who don't observe these days, the only time it occasionally comes to impact is when I get a call from a couple who want to get married and they can't find any rabbis who will do a wedding in that period after Passover, because it's these 33 days of the counting period, and I don't mind, but some rabbis do. And then finally, and this is perhaps my favorite one, this is a holiday that is not prescribed by the rabbis, but it is described by the rabbis as something that used to happen. And today it's been reclaimed, as you'll see why. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who used to be the head of the rabbinic court, said, "There were no days of joy in Israel greater than the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur." Just an aside, why do you think Yom Kippur was a day of great joy? Well, it was a day of joy because after Yom Kippur, your sins were forgiven. You made it. And you had another year. So the idea of Yom Kippur as a joyous day, we might not think of that. But the other fascinating thing here is, what is this 15th of Av? And again, you'll notice I have Hebrew letters at the top because Tu B'Av, as it's sometimes referred to, just like Tu B'Shvat, which is a a fruit holiday in the winter, refers to the number 15. Now, normally that wouldn't be how you'd count it, because Tet is the 9th letter and Vav is the 6th letter. Before it was the number for 30 and the number for 3. Easy. Why do they do 9 and 6? Well, the answer is, if they wrote 10 and 5, that would be Yud Hey, which is part of God's name. And so you shouldn't make the number that way. And Yud Vav would also be 2 letters in the Yud Hey Vav Hey name for God you're not supposed to say. So 15 and 16 are listed as 9-6 and 9-7 instead of 5-10 and 5 and 10 and 6. So it's Tu B'Av, or the 15th of Av, given that that superstition. So what made the 15th of Av joyful? Well, here's the description. On these days, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in borrowed white garments in order not to shame anyone who had none. All these garments required immersion. They came out and danced in the vineyards. So now, interesting. First of all, you have borrowed white garments so that everyone looks the same. And you can't choose who's rich and who's poor. They all borrowed them, so everybody had an equal opportunity. They had to go to the ritual mikveh bath to make sure they weren't menstruating and mess up the white dresses, but also for a sense of purity. And then they came out and danced in the vineyards. And what would they say when they were out there dancing? Young man, lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself. Do not set your eyes on beauty, but set your eyes on the family. Grace is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised. As it further says, give her the fruit of her hands and let her works praise her in the gates. What a fascinating relic. And what's even more interesting is that the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, is one of the saddest days in the Jewish calendar. It remembers the final destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Although even that date is a little bit fudged, because the book of Kings says it was burned on the 7th day, and the book of Jeremiah says it was burned on the 10th day. So they pick a day in the middle and call it the 9th day as the day to remember the temple destruction. But still, you've done a full day fast and then some. You've been mourning, you haven't eaten, you've been reading the book of Lamentations, which is sad and depressing, remembering the destruction of Jerusalem. And supposedly that's happening during this whole Second Temple period, when this same holiday of Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, was also taking place. It's a fertility rite. It's a Valentine's Day. It's a mating ritual. Who knows? But really fascinating relic here. And so this is why in modern Israel, now the 15th of Av has become a kind of Valentine's Day, or simply a celebration of love, a day of love. And that really adds to the Jewish calendar in a very meaningful way. One of the innovations of modern Jewish life is to take old holidays and give them new meanings. And if there's no ritual prescribed yet for the 15th of Av, you may not need to get in a white dress and go out into the fields and the vineyards. But you can find some way to say, it's a good day to say, I love you. And that still works. So, thus a quick tour through some obscure, lesser known Jewish holidays. Hopefully everybody heard at least one holiday they had never heard of before. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts, questions, comments, or other observations about these obscure events. Yes, Lori, please.
I just have a quick question, because I maybe everybody else knows, but I don't. Why did the rabbis shift the year by 6 months? Interesting question.
Some speculate that it was part of adopting the Babylonian calendar, and some speculate that it was a way to differentiate from other sects in Jewish life. There were some sects in Jewish life, like the Sadducees, that were much more rigidly tied to the written text of the Hebrew Torah, and the rabbis or the Pharisees, as the early rabbis, were a little bit more flexible in interpretation. And in the end, it's one of those mysteries. You'll get people speculating, but we don't have a clear document where the rabbis say, forget that Bible calendar, we're going to move. I mean, they even will say the Mishnah collection of rabbinic sayings on Rosh Hashanah, it says there are 4 New Years. There's a new year for trees, which is in the month of Shvat, and there's a new year for kings, and there's the new year for festivals, and that they put in the spring. But the new year for counting is in the fall. So they still mark that biblical calendar new year in the spring because it says explicitly in Leviticus, the first month is the spring with Passover. So they couldn't leave it behind. But when they designed their calendar, they shifted it a bit to make the new year in the fall closer to the Day of Atonement. Look, there's sort of a philosophical difference. When do you want your Day of Atonement? Do you want it in the middle of the 7th month, right in the middle of the year? Or do you want it right at the beginning of the year so you can start the year on a clean slate? Okay? You can see arguments for both sides. It's like doing course evaluations in the middle of the semester or course evaluations at the end of the semester. You know, one lets you get a full perspective on the year. The other lets you correct course mid-year, and you can fix anything that's going wrong. So evidently there was a change in philosophy where at one point they wanted the Day of Atonement right in the middle of the calendar, and later on they decided better to put it at the beginning of the year so we start on a clean slate. Yeah, Steve.
Judy and I have a funny story. We were planning our wedding back in the early 70s, and we said, hey, let's get married during spring break. It's a lot easier. We're both off and so on. And Judy's mom went nuts. She said, you can't do that. You can't do that. You got to get married before Pesach, and you got to get, or way after Pesach. Wait a few weeks. We had no idea why. Rabbi Strauss would not permit the wedding. So we got married on January 30th, in the middle of the coldest week in January. We had a snowstorm. My grandparents came up from Florida.
No. We didn't have a snowstorm on our wedding.
No,
day.
it was a couple of days before.
Way before.
It was 10 above.
But it was beautiful. The sun was out. It was a gorgeous day. It really was.
But my grandmother came up from Miami, and she says, what, a wedding in January? Are they crazy?
Couldn't find it.
You can't win. You get it from both sides.
Yeah, we got it.
Right.
So the Valentine's, the Day of Love, is the 15th of
15th of Av, which is in like August.
August.
Yeah.
Coming up.
Coming up. That's right. Sandra, William, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, are both of those calendars lunar?
Yes, they're both lunar calendars, although the biblical calendar, again, we don't know exactly how it functioned, how many days there were in a month and so on. But the rabbinic calendar runs basically on the model of the Babylonian calendar, which means it's by full moon. So there's 29 or 30 days in a month because the lunar cycle is 29 and a half days. And there's an extra leap month added 9 out of every 17 years. So instead of a leap day, which we have for our calendar to make it, 365.226 or whatever the decimal place is to match up with the sun and not lose days, their calendar loses 10 days a year, because if you have 12 months of 29 or 30 days, you wind up with 355 days. So after a couple years, you're going to find out Passovers in the winter, or it's not going to work well. So what they do instead is they add a full leap month every 2 or 3 years. So that's why Jewish holidays move back 10 days and back 10 days and forward 20 days and back 10 days and forward 20 days and back, and why they keep jumping around. I also say it's one of the reasons why it's very hard for Jews to be on time, because they don't even know what how the calendar is supposed to work. The other interesting parallel to that is the Islamic calendar is a purely lunar calendar. It only counts by the new moon. So it in fact does move holidays through the year. Ramadan, the month of fasting, could be in the winter, it could be in the spring. It moves through the seasons because they're losing 10 days a year on a purely lunar calendar. The actual technical term for the style of calendar that the Hebrew calendar is, and I am not joking, it is a lunisolar calendar. Now that's L-U-N-I, not L-O-O-N-E-Y. Yeah, Peggy and Bill.
Any difference between Ashkenaz and Sephardic holidays?
No, the calendar is the same, and the list of holidays is largely the same, but sometimes they're observed differently. I'll give you one example. There's a tradition in Morocco for the end of Passover. There's an observance called Miguna, which is actually a really nice example of community collaboration across religious boundaries. Remember, for Passover, the Jews are supposed to get rid of all wheat in the house, all bread, all they can have is matzah. What happens on Miguna is after the end of Passover, all of the Jews' non-Jewish neighbors bring them bread. So they can enjoy bread for the first time after the end of Passover. It can be a cake, or it could be pita bread, or some other kind of baked loaf. And it's a wonderful example of a symbiosis between the community, because they say, now, oh, we see that your holiday is over, you can have bread again, and they come and give them a gift of bread. That's specific to Morocco, although now it's observed a little bit more broadly. So there are examples like that. That doesn't happen in Eastern Europe, but they still mark Passover in the same time frame. So all these holidays that I mentioned would be observed in both communities and the observant members of the community. Yeah, David.
The lunisolar calendar, you said at 2 or 3, there's a leap month every 2 or 3 years.
Right.
Who decides and who says and who tells everybody?
Well, this has been actually mathematically calculated for a long time. It's not decreed, random or every 2 years. This has been scheduled out for a long time. Okay. It's actually, as I said, 9 every 17 years is the actual pattern, and that's been calculated out for a long way. But the interesting thing is, in the Islamic world, they're still relying on observation of the moon in Mecca to declare the beginning of a month. And that can actually be a challenge in the month of Ramadan, because you have to start to schedule special events. There's a major event called Eid, which takes place, and sometimes you only have very limited notice to do that. And so they've been lobbying in some cases to try to get the Islamic authorities in Mecca to use math. And, they invented the numerals. Let's use some math and just calculate it so we can plan ahead of time for this. But they're still stuck in the traditional model. The rabbis used to do an observation of the moon too, but it became a problem because they would observe the moon in Jerusalem and decide when the new moon has started. And if you're trying for Passover or for Sukkot, you got 15 days to get there and let people know when the moon was seen, because the holiday is on the 15th of the month. But what if you lived more than 2 weeks travel away from Jerusalem? You couldn't know when they'd seen the new moon. So that's when they started the second day of the holiday. And that's also when they decided to use math for the calendar instead of observation. So that goes back to like 400 or 500 of the Common Era, so about 1,500 years ago. Yeah, go ahead, Elliot.
So in modern day now, if they want to declare a holiday, say for Holocaust, who officially changes the calendar?
So you're right. There have been new holidays added, like Holocaust Memorial Day, Israeli Independence Day, and so on. And these have actually been decreed by the Israeli government. There is no Jewish pope who gets to decree holidays like that anymore. There isn't even an accepted Jewish Sanhedrin or court of rabbis that could make a decree. And so when they decided to choose a Holocaust Memorial Day, it was an act of the Knesset in 1952 or something like that that decreed that date. And it was a debate when they should put it, because some of them thought they should put it at the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, so they could emphasize the resistance part and not just the suffering part. The problem was the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion started on the first night of Passover. Kind of hard to do your Memorial Day that day. So in the end, they chose a day that was about halfway between the beginning of Passover and Israeli Independence Day, which was a historical date. Like they declared independence on a day that was already set. So they picked a day somewhere in between. So it's during this counting of the Bomer period, that sort of quasi-mourning period, that's when they set the Israeli Holocaust Day. But there are actually part of the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel who don't observe Yom HaShoah, who don't observe Holocaust Memorial Day. A, because they don't accept the legitimacy of the secular Israeli government, and B, because they said we already have a mourning day. Our day of sadness and mourning is Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And so we can cry for more than one thing then. We can cry for the temple, we can cry for the second temple, we can cry for the expulsion from Spain, we can cry about the Chmielnicki pogroms in 1666, we can cry about the Holocaust too. That's the day of sadness. So they didn't want a separate day to be decreed. So Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, is observed actually more by the liberal or secular parts of the Jewish world than by the most orthodox because it was new. From the Orthodox perspective, nothing new. You can't change that calendar once it was set in the days of the Talmud.